Hello, my name's Amy and welcome to another weekly writing vlog. Now first things first, I am still editing the Goldstone Tower. It's going well, but as usual with the editing process, it is a bit slower than I would have liked. This happens to me every single time I edit a book. I have not yet found a way around it. Or have I? We'll come to that in a bit. The reason I haven't really made many editing vlogs is because honestly there is not a lot to say. My editing process is very slow and very methodical, and I don't tend to have a lot of big revelations as I'm going through it, so it's not particularly interesting to film. So this week we're going to talk about something else. I think I mentioned it at the end of the last vlog, and that is the Snowflake Method. Now this is a method for outlining a book. There are many of these, of course, whether you're a big fan of Save the Cat or Romancing the Beat, whether you just stick to the 3-act structure or some variation of that. There are many different ways to structure a book, and there are even more ways to apply that to an outline. And I have tried outlining in the past, but I find it a bit stiff and unwieldy, honestly. No matter how good I think my outline is, when I come to write the book, it just lacks something. I'm not coming up with ideas on the fly. The characters and the plot don't seem to develop naturally, and I always feel those books that I've written from an outline feel a bit stilted. But as I also just said, editing takes me forever. It can easily take me twice as long to edit a book as it takes to draft it, and that is something I would really like to change. So what I would really like to do to try and avoid this extended editing period in the future is to find an outlining method that works for me. And this week I'm going to try the Snowflake Method. Now this method to me is perhaps not the simplest out there, but it feels like it has quite a lot of flexibility in it. You start off from a one-line hook which describes your book. You work up to a slightly longer synopsis, then you do some character work, then you come back and make a longer synopsis again, and by the end you will know your characters really well and you will have a list of scenes that you need to write. Now this final point seems quite appealing to me. In the past I think my outlines have made books a bit stilted because they have been too detailed, and that really kills the fluidity of the drafting for me. So I'm hoping with the Snowflake Method I will instead have just a one-sentence blurb of each scene, which will make sure I never go off track and I get all the information in that I need, but there will still be room to play around, to develop the world and characters as I go, and the draft will feel much more natural. So the book I'm going to be outlining this week is perhaps not the easiest one I could have chosen to start with. We will call it Project Immortals because it does not have a name. It is an epic fantasy. At the very low end it's going to be about 120,000 words. I expect it will get longer than that. It is the first book in a series, and I have currently written about 30,000 words of the draft. Now, I knew from the beginning what those first 30,000 words were going to be, so they were quite easy to draft. From this point though, things get a lot hazier, so this is why I want to apply the Snowflake Method and see if it can kick this book into gear. So the very first step, which I have already done, is to write a one-sentence description of the book. Now I've actually done two of these. I've done one for each of the two main characters because their paths do cross throughout the book, but they also spend a lot of time apart and really have their own storylines. So I've written one blurb for each of them, and then I have developed those one-sentence hooks into a paragraph each. Now this is where I came to the first stumbling block in the Snowflake Method. The description of the method says to take your one-sentence hook and turn it into about 5 sentences. There will be one sentence for the setup of the story, then 3 sentences that roughly correspond to the 3-act structure, and each of these sentences ends with a cliffhanger or disaster which propels you into the next act, and then there will be a final sentence to wrap everything up. Now, this is great, and I have done this for both of the main characters in Project Immortals, but it feels to me like there is a bit of a step missing here, and for me that is brainstorming. The only reason I was able to write these 5-sentence synopses was because I have already spent many months working on this book. I already had all my major plot twists, my midpoint, and similar disaster moments mapped out. If I had not had those, I would have had to spend a good week or so brainstorming between the first and second activities in the Snowflake method. So I think that is my first caveat about this method, and this probably goes for all outlining methods. Creating the outline is all very well, but for me there needs to be some kind of idea generation process mixed in with it. There needs to be time just writing down ideas in a notebook or some other form of brainstorming. And then using the outlining method, you can give structure to all your ideas. But I cannot just pluck the 3-act structure for an unwritten book out of the air. I need a lot of thinking time before I get to that point. So my story blurbs are written. I will probably go back and tweak them, but the next step is to move on to the characters. I'm going to sort of write a character profile for both of my 2 main characters. So I will report back when I've had a go at that. It is about 3 o'clock and I have just finished the next stage of my Snowflake Method outline. Now this section of the outline is working on characters, and for each of my main characters, because I have 2 with quite equal weight in the story, I had to write down their name, a 1-line story summary, their internal motivation, their external goal, their conflict, their epiphany, and finally a 1-paragraph story summary. Now, this was more interesting than I expected and also harder. I thought I knew these characters quite well, but I found it quite difficult to separate their internal and external conflict, goals, motivation. Perhaps that was just the wording of the topic headings that I took from the Snowflake method that threw me, but I found it really difficult to decide what were internal motivations of the characters and what were external goals. And also, because this is going to be quite a long book, I do feel like some of these things are going to change over time. So I've tried so far to focus on the first part of the story, but it was inevitable that later parts did creep into the outline. What was most interesting is that I did have a bit of an epiphany of my own on both characters. When I was thinking about how the characters will have changed by the end of the book and what they have to have learned, their own epiphany, in order to solve their problems, it gave me a really clear insight into how the way they've changed is going to carry them into book 2. There are going to be very specific realizations that both main characters will have had by the end of the first book, which will drive them into action in book 2. And that's something I've not really had before when writing a first book. One thing I did find is that writing both the 1-sentence summary and then the 1-paragraph summary of each character, I ended up just copying and pasting the things I'd written earlier. Perhaps I went wrong on the very first step, but because I did a hook and then a synopsis for each character, I'd kind of already done that point. I feel like my plot synopsis and my character synopses were probably not supposed to be identical, but I am not too worried about the fact that they are. I do feel like I'm making progress with understanding the story, and that is really all that matters. One thing I definitely do know is that this outline, however closely I follow the guidelines, is not going to be perfect on the first attempt. There is a reason I very rarely make it through an entire writing craft book, and that is because I learn best by doing. So I know I could go out and read the Snowflake Method book and get a lot more detail and a lot more examples, but for me personally, just throwing myself in at the deep end and having a go at writing this outline is probably going to teach me far more than any other way of learning. My goal really is just to get through the outline, have a rough draft of an outline if you like, and then see how it can be improved. And also, once I've got the basics of this method down, I think I will have a much stronger picture of how to do it better next time. Good morning, it is Tuesday, it is another really cold and blustery day, but I actually have quite a big update on my Snowflake Method outline. I decided to sit down last night and just do a little bit more work. Now, the next step of the process was to turn my single paragraph blurbs into a one-page blurb. Now, I was a little bit apprehensive about this. I didn't know if I was going to have to stop and do a lot more brainstorming, because I do know the events of the first third of the book really well because I've already written that section, but the rest of the plot is quite vague and I didn't know if I'd be able to just write a synopsis off the top of my head. I also wanted to combine the points of view of the two main characters. As I said yesterday, I wrote the initial parts, the one sentence hook and the one paragraph blurb for each of the characters separately. But for this one page synopsis, I wanted to bring them together so that I could see how the two storylines were going to play off one another and how much interaction the characters were going to have. So I sat down to get to work, fully aware that this might take a long time, that I might need to stop and brainstorm, that some of the paragraphs were going to look very, very slim because I didn't have a lot of story. And yet there was something about this process, maybe it's because I wrote it from beginning to end and it felt a little bit like writing just a story in 1,000 words, but the entire thing flowed so beautifully. I had written the entire synopsis in about 40 minutes and honestly, I just felt so jubilant when I'd finished it. It was just the same as finishing a really strong scene or even finishing an entire story. I was looking at the plot of a book that I genuinely want to read. And I don't think I've ever been so excited about a synopsis because honestly, I usually find the whole outline process pretty dry and boring. Now, there are definitely still some plot holes in this synopsis. I'm very aware there are points where I've brushed over how particular events are going to happen, and I can also see that the world building needs a lot of work. There are a lot of generic references to in the mountains or similar settings. Because this is epic fantasy and the setting is so integral to the story, I do want to put a lot more time into making sure each location really feels like a living place. And that is something that is not going to happen in this outline. It may be that I develop that on the page as I write the first draft, or I might do some separate world building work on my own. But the advantage of having done this one page synopsis is I can already see where these holes are. I can see how many settings I need, I can see which ones need more fleshing out, and honestly the whole process has just been really valuable and a lot quicker than I expected so far. So the next stage is to write my character arcs. This is a big one for me because if you've watched any of my editing vlogs, you will know I always spend a lot of time revising and revamping character arcs when I edit a book. And I always try to develop them before I write the first draft, and yet I never seem to quite pull it off. They always seem a bit weak and flimsy and they end up changing a lot as I draft. So it's going to be really interesting to try and write them out in the outline. But that is the next step. I am excited to see how this outline develops, and I will check in when there is more to share. It has been a good 2 or 3 weeks since I updated this vlog, but I have still been working on the outline for Project Immortals. The stage I have just completed was to write out full-page character arcs for the main characters. Now, this was a really useful task. I thought I had quite a good grip on the character arcs in this particular book. They have been in the back of my head since I first came up with the story idea, but there is quite a difference between having a vague one-sentence idea in the back of your head and actually writing it out and making it fill an entire page. The really important thing here was that writing these full-page character arcs forced me to really think through the journey the characters will go on. Each plot point has to lead into the next one, there has to be a progression, and it was really easy to see with one character in particular that there were a couple of spots where I had very little detail. I had an idea of how the character was going to progress, but I didn't exactly know what was going to cause that progression, and I could definitely see that in the outline. There were certain paragraphs on the page that were very, very slim, and I could see I just did not have enough detail in them. Now, the next stage of the outline is to do the same for secondary characters, but only writing half a page for each of those. I've got 2 other points of view in this book with characters who'll probably just narrate a small number of chapters each, but they will have arcs, so I want to write those out next. And I also think I'm going to do a couple of half-page arcs for 2 of the antagonists. This is something I've definitely neglected to do with books in the past, and I can always tell that I did not have a good handle on the antagonist when I come to edit. And beyond that, I then get into what is possibly the most intimidating part of the outline. First, I have to turn everything I've done so far into a really detailed 4-page synopsis, and then beyond that, I have to write up a scene list. And that is what I will use to write the book. But I am going to save that for another vlog because this one has been in the works for many, many weeks already, and it is time to wrap things up. My experience with trying the Snowflake method so far has been surprisingly positive. I am not an outliner by nature. I usually have a vague idea of a story going into writing it, but that often amounts to just a few pages of notes written by hand. It is rare that I have anything this detailed, and when I've tried to write outlines in the past, I tend to come up with these bullet-pointed lists which feel very dry and sterile, and honestly they tend to lead to quite dry and sterile first drafts. My feeling at the moment is that the Snowflake method is producing an outline that has much more of the spontaneity of an ordinary first draft, and I absolutely love that. I said in an earlier clip that as I was writing out one of the synopses, I did actually feel the same exhilaration I would feel from drafting. That was a really good sign for me. That to me means that the plot is coming together and that it is actually going to be fun to both write and read, because that has not always been my experience working from outlines in the past. So thank you for following along with this journey so far. I'm really intrigued to see how the rest of the outline pans out, and of course the drafting process. It is going to be a while before I actually draft this book. It is not on the schedule for this year, I don't think, but trying to outline an epic fantasy has been quite an experience, and it has given me a really good taste of the Snowflake method so far. But I do have a couple of other books I would like to write this year, and I may also try outlining those, so look out some vlogs about that process coming very soon. Until then, keep writing everyone, and I'll see you next time.